Welcome, Omid, to the 1% Project.
Thanks, Pritish. Great to be on it.
You were born and brought up in Germany, but you had a career starting in LATAM, in Google, and then you have moved around all over the world. So, give us a tour of your career across the different parts of the world.
Yeah, so my name doesn't reveal it, but I was actually born and raised in Germany. My parents are both from Iran, and I actually spent, the first 20 or so years of my life living in Germany. I studied here in Germany and ended up also spending part of my studies in Argentina, where I started learning Spanish and really being exposed to Latin American culture. Upon graduating from undergrad, which was a German business school, I ended up joining Google in Dublin. I spent 2 years in Dublin in Ireland, at the European headquarters of Google, but then transitioned with Google to the US, where I spent another 4 years, actually based in San Francisco, but working on the Latin American market. That was a time where I almost spent more time in Latin America than I spent in the US. So sometimes people think I actually lived in Latin America for 4 years, which I somewhat did, but not really, because my base was up in the States. Once I finished those 6 years with Google, I ended up going to business school at Stanford for 2 years. While I was at Stanford, I developed a very big passion for all things related to Asia and China specifically. At that point in my career, I felt I had done, I had my Middle Eastern background, I had my European kind of upbringing and education and work experience. I had done the US and Latin America, but really Asia was kind of the part of the world that was still very unexplored for me. And that's why and when I decided to both spend during my business school experience, but also after my business school experience in Asia. So I ended up working briefly for Monk Hill Ventures in Singapore and in Jakarta, the VC investment firm. And then after graduation from business school, I ended up moving to China, to Beijing, joining micromobility and bike sharing company Ofo, spending about a year and a half with them, and then spending another year and a half in Shanghai, starting a company in the cross-border e-commerce space. And then after 3 years in China, that's kind of when, out of both personal and professional reasons, I decided to move back to the States, where at the beginning of 2020, I returned to the Bay Area, to San Francisco, and joined Robinhood, which is a stock trading and securities trading platform. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a bit of a kind of a round the world ticket that I just gave you, but I ended up back in the States for now, and I'm physically in Germany now, by the way, for this conversation. So all places are still pretty active in for me.
Absolutely. And that's an excellent tour of the world. You've spent a good amount of your career building and scaling businesses. Ofo in China, you have your own e-commerce platform. Now you're with Robinhood. So, what does scaling a new business mean?
Yeah, I think great question, but I think the answer depends also on multiple factors. I think scaling a business depends on where you are in your journey as a company. I think when you're scaling a business after you found product market fit. You don't do it before. And I'm saying this with a smile because I've been part of company journeys where a company would scale its product at a time when the product market fit wasn't there. And then when you suddenly don't have the unit economics working for you, when you don't have the fit, scaling can go very wrong. Like, you can burn a lot of money, and you can end up taking products into markets that don't work, and you're scaling something that is not operationally replicable. So it's really important, as you think about scale, to kind of be aware of where you are in the process of finding your product market fit. And second, I think the core of really what scaling for me is, or has always been, is, okay, we found product market fit. We have something that works. Now, how can we replicate it as quickly as possible, as numerously as possible, but doing so while we're still learning? Like, you still want this aspect of iterating and learning, which brought you to that product market fit. You want to maintain that. But now that you found something that works, you want to do that over and over and over again. So it's really about setting the stage to enable and support growth in your company, and having that growth, when you think about it organizationally, really reducing all the barriers for that growth. And that is an exercise of bringing together planning and funding and having the systems and the staffing and the processes, the technology, the partners, and so on and so forth. So it's a multiple pieces that really need to fall into place. I think another way to, by the way, of thinking about scale is, and scale and growth are very often used interchangeably. The difference I see very much is, if you think of growth, like almost a dictionary definition is, you add a resource and you get like more output. Like there's almost like a linear relationship between input and output. I think what you want to achieve with growth, with scale, is where like you can grow faster without necessarily having to linearly increase your input resources. Like you actually have an exponential type of growth behind it. And I think great example for that is Google. Google itself, with like multiple, like I think somewhere between 7 to 10 business units or products that are being used by over a billion users. But at the same time, the company itself only has like 110, 115,000 employees. So having that, like that is not just growth. That's actually scale, where your input doesn't necessarily change meaningfully, but your output does. And that's often like an outcome of improving between the funding that goes in and the headcount that goes in and the output that you have, like all the stuff in between. The very much also intangible stuff in between, the processes, the culture, the mindset of individuals, and so on and so forth.
True. And I think you touched upon a great point. One of my previous guests had mentioned the assessment of a product market fit is when people are coming to you to get your products and you are selling off the shelf. You don't have to go to anybody to sell your product or your service. So the way to assess that you have product market fit is when people are coming to you. And most, I think, young founders, first-time founders, they probably do the scaling or the growth midway product market fit. And that becomes quite a challenge. And also, I think people don't spend enough time and think that product market fit takes time and sometimes takes years before you actually get to that level.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
So coming to the next part of this is there a framework for scaling a business?
I think good question. I do believe in frameworks in general. I like to have them. I like to fall back on them. I don't think that necessarily that I don't necessarily believe in a framework for scaling. I think, VCs are making billion-dollar bets on a founder's ability to scale a business. And if it could all be compressed into a simple framework that's replicable, that can be printed and shared among founders, then, you wouldn't have any funded startup that fails, because the idea is like you have the funding, you have the framework, just go and run with it. And I think the reason why I don't believe in it is because I think scaling a business is a management and leadership activity of the utmost complexity, and one that is like heavily influenced by a lot of factors which can't always be controlled, like the timing, the stage of the company, the competitive landscape, the speed to market, founder and their skill set, company culture, the resources you have available. I think there's just so many components in a startup story, in a startup growth story, scale story, that vary from one company to the next, that vary from one founder to the next. So I'm not a big believer of that. I think of frameworks in that space. I don't doubt that lessons can be learned in one scaling journey and then applied to another, but putting it into a replicable framework, I have not seen that yet. What I have seen though is a good book that was written about kind of growing companies, and that's the Growth Handbook by Elad Gil. And I think that's I read that book. It was I think Andreessen Horowitz gives it out to anyone who comes through the door visiting the company. That's how I got it. And it's pretty much like if you take the most successful founders in Silicon Valley, of the most successful businesses, they have come together and really tried to, from like function and chapter, like from resources to leadership, human resources to leadership, and so on and so forth. They've written down some of their thoughts around like what to do at what point. And that is like, yes, there's wisdom, there's guidance. And I think that's why you have this entire industry of like, people sharing their experiences, making money off of that. But framework would be tough to have that for scaling.
Sure. And are there any tangibles and intangible aspects of scaling?
Yeah, I've been thinking a little bit about this question of, what's tangible and intangible in a startup scaling journey. I think the two things really that I find tangible, relatively tangible. I think it's two and a half things, I would say. The two things are both your input and your output. And your input is what? It's the funding. You can argue money is pretty tangible, and your headcount. By the way, on that note, I say funding and headcount. For me, if you're because scaling can happen at a startup, it can happen at a corporation as well. And but your input is different. Like if you're a startup, your input is pretty much the money you have available to do the things you want to do. In a corporation, it is probably more the headcount that headquarters assigns to a unit. So I'm using this a little bit interchangeably. It depends though on where the company is and what the company does and what stage they're at in the context, if it's a startup versus a corporate. But your input, I find that pretty tangible, and your output. This is kind of what you measure. That's what you justify that input with. You go in and say, listen, if you give me this money, I give you this output. I give you these metrics. I give you this return. And I think that's fairly tangible and measurable. The other half factor that I said, like two and a half things that I find tangible, is the product itself. It's fairly tangible. You can argue one way or another. You can, like, if it's a physical product, it's tangible. If it's a software product or an experience, then you can still have someone like spend an hour with it or a week with it and form an opinion about it. But a lot of the things in between, the team culture you build, intangible. Yep. The ability of your staff to overcome barriers and keep innovating, pretty much intangible. Your timing intangible. Your ability to learn and iterate as you go, intangible. I think there's more intangibles than tangibles, and I think that's why I come back to my previous answer of like, why is it so hard to build a framework? It's because it's really hard to capture all these different factors that change from one journey to another. And I really believe that if you look at serial founders, like look at I think Stuart Butterfield, if I got his name correct, he's the founder. He was founder of, what was it? Was it Flickr, I think, first, and then Slack. So he built two really big businesses, sold them both times to. Let me think who sold. I forgot who he sold Flickr to, but I think Yahoo. And then now obviously
Slack to
Salesforce. Slack to Salesforce. And like you could look at him and say, well, he did it twice. He has the blueprint. He has the framework. But I'm pretty sure that he would also come and say, yes, there were some similarities, but these are very different stories, very different products, very different people, very different timing. So I think there's more intangibles, and I think that's why scaling is also so important to look at, where it's so important to look at the founder and their ability to perceive, to process, to guide, to think ahead, to look forward, because these are all the things that matter when it comes to intangible things.
How important is money?
I think I said it. I think it's very important. The thing is, the idea of scaling is actually almost like contrarian to money, because the idea here is you do more with less money. That is what you're selling. You give me some money and I give you like 5x the returns, 10x the returns. That's scale, but you still need the money. And I think it's a little bit funny about that's a little bit funny, but the beauty is that the scalability and the replicability that you show, that attracts money. Like I don't know any VC who wouldn't like to have this, this ideal scenario of like a company that has found product market fit and that has shown how every additional dollar that you put into it, that you pour almost like gasoline. Yeah, exactly. Like propels and ends up with like a multiple of a return. So if you can show how your economics improve with your scale, if you can show how each new unit is going to cost less and increasingly drive the bottom line growth, that attracts money. So that's also, by the way, why you really have VCs with growth funds. Like the idea of a growth fund is exactly that. We have a company that has proven that unit economics are working, or at least they're close to working, and that with more money we can actually get there. So yeah, it's interesting. So you need money to scale, but also scale attracts the money at the same time.
Yeah. You have been in growth teams, led growth teams, and built potentially a number of growth plans for different products and services. When you go in as the first-time presentation and speak to the team and the founders, how do you convince them that your plan or your ideas or your thoughts of the next steps of scaling are or should be the direction or the steps that the company should be taking?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it's, again, there's no recipe for how you generally have to pitch opportunities to leadership team. I think one thing though that is always the same is you have to speak their language. You have to frame things and position things and storytell what you need in the context of what they care about. I think I'm thinking back of a few experiences that I had specifically at Google. Let me give you some context on that first. This is 2009. This is Google Cloud in 2009. Now Google Cloud is a really big business. I think it has, multiple thousand employees. It makes multiple billions of revenue for the company. And it's one of the big bets that Google has. But at the point when I joined, we were globally, I think, somewhere between a couple hundred, a few hundred employees, 400 or 500. We were doing millions of revenue, not billions. And the idea that in a few years we could even dream about getting to $1 billion revenue runway was ludicrous at that point. But it was very early stage, and we had just started cloud in the US. We had brought a few products out into the market, and we're now looking at replicating that in other markets. We were basically, our leadership team in the US came and said, hey, we want to take this to Europe. We want to make this work in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, EMEA, EMEA. So I was very fortunate at that point to be hired into a team. We were just my manager and I and one colleague of mine. And the three of us, we had to figure out, how do we take these products from the US market into the European market and show exactly what I just talked about. Here's an opportunity, and if you give me that headcount, if you give me that money, here's what I'm going to deliver to you. And that's how it started. It almost starts like you seeding a team and you're making a bet. Even and our leadership was not VC, but it's still kind of almost VC thinking. I'm going to give them some money, I'm going to see where it goes. So that's how it started. And after, with that money, we started hiring a few people. We started setting up the processes. We started kind of, calling clients cold first, or whatever we got inbound. And we were proving, we were showing that, hey, with this investment, this is what you can expect as a return. With one headcount, we can generate on a quarterly basis $200,000 of revenue. Well, and this is only now. Maybe in 2-3 quarters from now, once we improve this system, once we fill this role, once we connect this pipe where there's leakage in our funnel, we can actually get to $500,000 of revenue per person. And that's how you want to position things. It's almost like an ROI conversation. Give me some more money, and this is exactly what I'm going to do with it, and this is the return that you can be expecting. And that, when you ask how do you want to position things, you gotta. That's what the team in the US at that point cared about. We want the team to grow. We want this to be our next successful business. We have some money. We just need to make sure that it's the place to invest it in. Guess what? They were doing similar bets in Asia Pacific and in Latin America and different regions, and they wanted to see, who can return the better return. And I think even in a corporate environment, that is still the case. Even at any point in time, you have to come and show that whatever you're working on, whatever project you're working on, how it compares, how it looks next to all these other investment opportunities that a leadership team has. And that what you're providing has one of the best ROIs that you can, that's actually the case. That's how I think about some of the work we do at Robinhood. Our leadership team can invest its time and resources and money, which are the limiting factors to a large degree, in a number of projects. But what are the ones that actually drive the things that the team cares about? And that might change the things that they care about. There's a phase where the team cares about really just growth. Other times where it's about reducing cost. Other times where it's about revenue. And I think that's why you got to be very kind of thoughtful of what matters to the leadership team, and frame your story of your this is the input I'm requesting and this is the output I'm giving you based on what they care about. I've had experiences where I brought an opportunity to the table to our leadership team, and I just wasn't speaking their language. And it took months for them to buy into that until I changed the way I position it. There was a specific partnership deal in Argentina, and it was a partner. We had about 50,000 clients with this partner. It might not seem a lot, but it was really meaningful. It was really meaningful for the Argentinian market. And all the time I would tell our leadership team, like, hey, we gotta help this partner. We gotta invest in this partner. We got 50,000 clients. If we don't, they're gonna run to our competitor, which at that point was Microsoft. And that didn't resonate. It didn't resonate until I changed the narrative. It wasn't, my narrative previously was like, we got to help this partner, we're going to lose this client. But that's not what my leadership team cared about. They cared about, show us where this partner is going to be in 3 to 5 years if we give you that money now. And the conversation changed. I was like, okay, if we give them the money now, if we make these investments, if we help these 50,000 clients, here's how in 3 years, this partner could be the number 1 partner in Argentina, could be the number 2 or number 3 partner across Latin America, could help us in certain markets against Microsoft, and so on and so forth. Like you really gotta be very mindful of what the leadership team cares about to talk to them and to communicate that growth vision.
Yeah. Now, you've worked across so many continents and regions and countries. What are the nuances of scaling a business in these regions like LATAM, US, Southeast Asia, China?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. I think every market is different, but I think the differences you see are more cultural leadership differences, because the exercise of scaling is not that different. Like you're still achieving, like what you're trying to do is the same if it's in China or in Europe or in the United States, right? You're trying to grow a business, and that looks pretty much, the concept is pretty much the same across different markets. But I think what I've seen, the differences I've seen really is in the leadership team, in the leadership mindset, and the culture. I think in the US and with Western, let's kind of categorize it into Western and Eastern, or like Western and Asian. I think that that's where I see the split. I don't necessarily see a meaning, like there's differences between Europe and the US, but
sure,
not to the degree that they are between Western and Eastern cultures. I found Western decision making to be much more long term, with much more foresight, 3 to 5 years of planning, thinking when it comes to decision making, very thoughtful. I found from my experience, and I might have a very biased experience based on just 2-3 experiences I had in both Southeast Asia and in China, but I found decision making to be much more short term. The horizon of leadership and their decision making, short term, much more like opportunistic, transactional, and with that, just all over the place at times. Like I think one thing that really stood out to me in China was that when you look at successful companies, or let's say companies in general, tech companies, founders I felt they always believed they could do anything. Like I'll give you an example. Ofo started out as a bike sharing company. And they went through a lot. But you know what they are now? Do you have an idea?
They're
an e-commerce business now. They're an e-commerce, but they pivoted into an e-commerce business, and of course there's a story behind it, and I think the story with Ofo specifically is you had just a lot of eyeballs on the app, and suddenly you don't have the bikes anymore. You cannot find the hard word either. You cannot fund it, and so what do? You want to still monetize the eyeballs. They started selling securities and financial products, and then moved into e-commerce. But that's an extreme example of a company that had to innovate to survive, or pivot. Let's not call it innovate, but pivot. I think there's many other examples of Chinese companies. Like take Meituan. Meituan started as a food review, like a Yelp of sorts business. At some point, and in a market where Didi, the car sharing, ride sharing app, was very successful with very high market share of 70% plus. Meituan said, we're gonna get into ride sharing. Like I feel like Chinese, and they're doing pretty well now too, but of course heavily funded, heavily subsidized the business to achieve growth. But my point is, there's like, when I said all over the place, I felt like Chinese leadership doesn't see limits, and then kind of really believes they can do anything, and then jumps into it as well. And that's what I meant earlier with like very opportunistic, very transactional. Like, okay, we got an opportunity, let's do it. Like we don't see the limits. Whereas within the Western leadership, when it comes about growing a business, it's very thoughtful. Like, okay, well, let's think about it. Let's plan. Does it fit into, how does it compare to that? And so on and so forth.
So that's a very interesting point, because Previously, I had another guest, and she is the head of Kingship, which is Mars' pet care company. And
Mm-hmm.
after speaking to her, I realized that Mars's biggest business is actually pet care, not M&M chocolates. What she mentioned is the reason the Chinese founders need to diversify or vertically or horizontally grow is because trying to get or capture a consumer in China is expensive. And once you have got that consumer, you want to provide them all the services possible so that they stay within your ecosystem. Because if because it is very difficult to actually compete with the Alibabas and the Taobao and the WeChat ecosystem already. But you've got this customer who probably is buying dog food from you, and you now want that person to also buy the other products and services. The only reason to do that is survival.
Yeah.
Because if that expensive consumer goes to another platform and the competition is so huge because you may have other guys also doing dog food or pet care, you don't have an option but to innovate or vertically grow or horizontally grow. So potentially, I think that makes the Chinese entrepreneurs fearless,
Yeah.
and they potentially don't have an option because that is the way to survive. But I think
Yeah.
that's one way of looking at it.
I think that's a great additional perspective, and there's definitely some truth to it. Like China, the Chinese market, Chinese tech market is much more about it's much more of an ecosystem play if you can afford it as a company, like an ecosystem lock-in. I think that's really the benchmark that was set with Alipay and with Tencent and WeChat. So it makes sense for a competitor to like want to pursue a similar approach of, okay, like how can we actually, once we have someone through the door, how can we actually serve them horizontally with all the other services? I can see that.
Yeah. So tell us about your present gig, Robinhood. How has that company been able to scale so fast, as well as become popular all over the world? And as you mentioned before we started this interview, that it's not outside the US, but people outside the US know about it.
Yeah, I think Robinhood is a great example of you know of a disruptive technology, of a disruptive approach to something that was very established. If you look at what Robinhood did, I think it started out in about 2013, 2014. It came in, it looked at investment and trading, buying and selling securities, and said, why is this only accessible to a small subset of our population? Why is it so expensive? Why is it so hard to get into? And how can we change that? Like the world back then was multiple more, like when you thought of investing, like myself, like that's how I thought about it, and I'm sure other people too. Was like you like think of Wall Street, of people screaming. You think of multiple monitors and something that takes 24/7. Like you constantly, like you have to be very consumed by it, and it was expensive too. Like you got commission and fees and whatnot. And basically what Robinhood came and did was, can we redesign this approach to investing? Can we make it more accessible? Can we make it accessible by making it mobile first and removing the fees? And that's really what the company did over the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years since it launched. I think what it did really well was it had this approach, this waitlist approach. It really it's pretty much a case study of how to do waitlists nowadays, of amassing millions of people before your product even launched, and allowing people to skip the wait list by bringing in more friends and whatnot. And by the time it launched, it was very well received. I remember starting using it and being very surprised how easy I could just buy and sell within a day, which you shouldn't, by the way, but within a day, buy and sell a security, literally with a swipe. And I think that's really that's the appeal, I think, of Robinhood, the accessibility, the fact that something that was out of reach is now accessible to a lot of people. And it's really about what I gotta say, what the company ethos is. It's really about democratizing finance for all. And it's like making the financial system accessible to most people. And I think that is something that is not just exclusive to the US. You have people in India, in Europe, in China, in Asia that are not participating in the financial system the way they should. And the numbers, like I think a very large percentage of like 90, like I don't know the specific number, I wish I had it handy now, but a very large percentage of all stocks sit within with the top 10 or 20% of the population. And making that accessible is a good thing. Now, obviously, you have to do it. You have to provide a lot of education. You have to do hand holding. You have to really provide the features that users need to understand your product and understand what they're doing. So it's an ongoing journey. I think the company has been doing really well. It's interesting to see how in other markets competitors have emerged. It's thankfully a very regulated business. If it wasn't, literally anyone could come and do that. I've been in mobility, and it was very unregulated with bike sharing, and the next thing you know, you have 70 players in the market. And thankfully, that's not the case with Robinhood. But it also makes it difficult to grow. You have to be very thoughtful. You have to really obey and thankfully so really follow the rules. But nevertheless, I think Robinhood has had a few very good years. The turmoil at the stock market in 2020 has certainly led a lot of people to look into investing and wanting to be part of both the ups and the downs. I think each market movement attracts a certain type of investor. And if you can provide the platform for that, it does provide a great destination for someone who's interested in it.
Absolutely. So before you joined Robinhood and you transitioned out of OFO, you built an e-commerce platform as well, Flamingo. So
yeah.
Given so many e-commerce platforms already there, what's the white space that you see?
Yeah, I got to give you a little bit of context. So this is me in China 2017-18. And the thing that was really, the industry that was really booming next to mobility and micro mobility was actually social commerce. So not just e-commerce, it was really social commerce. And I was introduced to the former CFO of Xiaohongshu, which is Little Red Book, a very very popular platform, social commerce platform, as well as, well, he was CFO there, and then he went on to be the CFO at Pinduoduo, which is at this point a New York Stock Exchange listed company, and doing really, really well in China. And he was leaving his CFO position and thinking about, he had studied in the US and looking at the kind of the Chinese social commerce market and comparing that with the US. We saw a gap. There were basically two trends we saw. One was you have social commerce in China, you don't necessarily have it in the US. And the second trend we saw was cross-border e-commerce. So we saw more and more, and I think this was led by Wish.com and AliExpress and a bunch of larger players in the space that were proving that cross-border is a thing. So if you can get consumers to be comfortable with the idea of ordering something from China at a meaningful reduction of the price, the question then is how can you then change parts of the experience to make it more fun, more reliable, and better quality? And that is kind of where we saw social commerce, or the social elements of commerce, coming in. Interestingly enough, if you look at the US, there is, when you think of commerce, there's clearly one player, and that's Amazon. And when you think of social, there's obviously the Facebook ecosystem. But Amazon Amazon as a commerce player doesn't do social really well. And the Facebook ecosystem as a social player doesn't necessarily do commerce really well, even though that is something that they're investing in or have invested in over the last 2 years. So we saw that as an opportunity. We came in, raised money, started a company, 50 plus employees. Admittedly, it wasn't easy in context of the trade war and everything that happened in 2020 between China and the US. But the company's doing well. I left it myself at some point to move back to the States, but my co-founding team is running it, and I only hear good things. So we're still in touch and we talk regularly. So that's the story behind Flamingo.
Got that. So let's get to your personal experience. You have had so many growth gigs. If you had to do any of your previous gigs again, which one it would be, and how would you do it differently?
Yeah, I think about that very frequently, as a matter of fact. It's the gig I would almost say I'm least proud of, in terms of overall contribution to the world. It was my stint with OFO, and I say least proud of. I gotta be have to maybe rephrase it. It was a great experience. I just think it was not the best industry and not the best player in that industry. I think it was a very wasteful player and a very wasteful approach to mobility, and that's kind of really what bugs me in hindsight. I wish I had all the knowledge and all the kind of insight I have now, and I would have applied it more there. I would have pushed back more to leadership. I would have kind of called out some of the things we were doing more frequently and sooner in my experience there. Also, there were a few cultural things. That was my first job in China, and I was still navigating the complexities of working in a Chinese company. And that was my first year. And I think, looking back, there's so much I learned over the three or so years that I spent in China. And I wish I had that knowledge earlier on in my journey. And so that's probably why I would say OFO is kind of the one opportunity I would like to relive and do it differently.
Now let's get to a rapid fire. One question, one word, or a one sentence response.
Yeah.
The hardest thing about your job?
Making yourself seen in a company and an environment that is growing so fast. It's a new team. It's a new function that I'm building, and making people see what you do, evangelizing your work. I think that's a challenge sometimes.
One book or a blog that has influenced you the most?
Yeah, this hands down, read it multiple times. The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. Forgot the author, but it's a self-help book. Love it. Has been very inspiring.
Your most favorite superhero?
My dad, hands down. Many people might say that, and it certainly is the case for me. It's the one person I look up the most.
Brilliant. Omid, it was a pleasure having you on the 1% Project.
Thank you, Pritish.